Stardew Valley, the game that started the renaissance of farming games in 2022. How did a small game developed by a single independent developer manage to begin a new generation of farming games when it isn't exactly the first of its kind? Nintendo have always released this genre of games since 1996, starting with the original Harvest Moon for the Super Nintendo. The game features a similar concept with Stardew Valley. The player inherits a plot of land from a predecessor and is tasked to turn that land back into a thriving farm. Both games choose to highlight the beauty and simplicity of rural life and the small and gentle dramas that come along with it. But where Harvest Moon stopped, Stardew Valley decided to take it a step further. But what exactly did Stardew Valley do right that Harvest Moon didn't do? To answer this question, we must first look at Stardew Valley's story during its release. Stardew Valley was released in 2016 by Concerned Ape, and at the time, published by Chucklefish before he chose to go fully independent. During the first 2 months of its release, Stardew Valley sold over 1 million copies. The game was a massive success, especially for a lone indie developer. Even after having such a high performance, Concerned Ape continued to develop the game after taking in feedback from the growing community, and even adding a multiplayer feature for people who want to play Stardew Valley with friends. Accessibility was the goal, and Concerned Ape delivered. The same year of its release, Stardew Valley was ported to Mac, Linux, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. In 2017, the port for the Nintendo Switch was released, and in 2018, the port for iOS and Android was released. Clearly, accessibility was not an issue for Stardew Valley. Whatever device you had, you can play the game. On the other hand, during 2016, Harvest Moon sequels were released across some platforms. Harvest Moon Seeds of Memories for the iOS and Android, and Harvest Moon Skytree Village for the Nintendo 3DS. During that year, Harvest Moon did not release a game for the PC, which meant that Stardew Valley had no competitors in that platform. It's important to note that Stardew Valley had the highest selling copies on the PC. During the year of its release, Stardew Valley was already beating Harvest Moon in accessibility. The platform choice of Stardew Valley can contribute to the message that they want to deliver. Stardew Valley offers an escape from urban life to a much simpler rural life. What better way to deliver this message than to discourage people from purchasing newer platforms to play the game? If the player has a PC with bad specs, they can play the game. If the player has a Mac, they can play the game. If the player does not have any computer, he can still play the game. There's no need to support a corporation in order to play the game. Just sticking with what the player has is enough to play the game. I myself have played Stardew Valley on a laptop with 2 GB of RAM and an Intel Atom processor, and it ran decently well. Going to the graphics, Stardew Valley features a 2D pixel art style, whereas Harvest Moon, Seeds of Memories, and Skytree Village feature a 3D art style. Most of the time, I would say that the difference in the enjoyment between 3D and 2D art styles are dependent on the player's preference, and to some degree, negligible due to the limitations faced by Concerned Ape as an indie developer. However, in the case of Stardew Valley, it is arguably an important feature with the message that Concerned Ape was trying to deliver. Stardew Valley wanted to highlight the simplicity and beauty of rural life in a distant provincial area, similar to Harvest Moon. But Stardew Valley adds to the story by rejecting urban lifestyle and urban development by showing scenes of corporations damaging nature in a rural setting. Stardew Valley delivers this message simply by rejecting the 3D graphics art style that is sometimes the art style of what is considered as modern games, where 3D graphics with more minute details is the name of the game. Games like Spider-Man Remastered or God of War 4 will try to bring the player into its world by providing graphics that are close to realistic, with environments that would mirror real life or mirror what it would look like if it was in real life. Instead, Stardew Valley rejects this modern standard of video games and chooses to embrace what is considered as more old-school graphics. The simplicity of pixel art brings back the memories of people to a time when video games were much simpler, with games like Pokemon Red for the Game Boy Color or Legend of Zelda for the Super Nintendo. So while Harvest Moon was trying to appeal to the modern community by having 3D graphics, Stardew Valley stayed true to its message by embracing the 2D pixel art style of a bygone era of video games. In terms of mechanics, both games have large similarities. For simplicity purposes, I will only be comparing Harvest Moon's Skytree Village and Stardew Valley, rather than all three games for 2016. For Skytree Village, when the player starts a new game, the player is dropped into a story information dump for more or less 6 minutes, a classic trait of most Japanese titles, and then into a tutorial that will last for a few more minutes. For Stardew Valley, on the other hand, the player gets an information dump of the story for 4 minutes, then just immediately dropped into the world. Though it is important to note that there is already a button on the character creation screen to skip the intro for players that do not really care much about the story. Stardew Valley would often do this for all the mechanics found in the game, where the player will simply just learn them on their own. Similar to the original plot, where you are a desk worker learning what life is like in Stardew Valley. The mechanics of different tasks in Stardew Valley will not be fed to the player, and instead just be self-discovered. When the player tries fishing, he will learn how to play the fishing minigame. When the player starts mining, he will be handed a sword before going down, which implies that the player will need to use the sword. A lot of Stardew Valley's mechanics hinge on the player trying something new, which leads to discovering more of the gameplay mechanics of Stardew Valley. For progression, both Skytree Village and Stardew Valley offer some similarities, primarily in the visual development of the farm. As the player spends more time playing the game, the plot of land will naturally start to gain more and more life. There will be various crops that need to be watered or harvested, and animals roaming around. For Skytree Village, it diverges due to the addition of getting a bigger plot of land for farming as the game progresses, due to the plot of how reviving more Skytrees will bring in more villagers, which will lead to a larger farmland. There's also the progression of getting married and having a family, which has been one of the most important parts of the Harvest Moon franchise. However, this progression falls short when you start to explore the villages and talk to people. They don't really have much to offer, since the villagers will repeat the same lines whenever talked to. The villages become more dead after the tree has been revived due to how the villagers feel like two-dimensional NPCs with no life or soul. On the other hand, Stardew Valley's progression has been praised by many players. I will just give a brief idea on the progression in Stardew Valley, since others have already covered that topic much more in depth. To start, the visual development of the farm is by far one of the biggest parts of Stardew Valley's progression. As the player progresses, he is given different tools and paths in order to make the plot of land feel like a thriving farm. The player even has the complete freedom to be able to decide what kind of farm they will have. Players can choose to be a full crop farmer, where they will plant different kinds of crops that they will harvest and process or sell. The player can choose to be a full-on rancher, where they will take care of a lot of animals, albeit a very time-consuming routine. A beekeeper, a flower farmer, a fish pond user, a slime ranch abuser, or a mix or any of all of these. The world is your oyster, pun intended. No matter which route the player chooses, the farm will show progress visually and start to feel like a thriving farm. Heck, there's an entire subreddit of people sharing what their farms look like, and people can create some really beautiful Stardew Valley farms. The next form of progress is in skill development. As the player does tasks in the game, the player will naturally become more proficient at a skill. Harvest crops, become a better farmer. Fight mobs, become a better fighter, and many more. It feels rewarding to advance these skills because the player actually learns new crafting recipes per tier of skill leveled up that increases specialization. For example, get your first tier in farming and you'll learn how to craft a scarecrow, a construction that stops crows from eating crops while the player is asleep. There's also the actual skill specialization, where the player can choose to have a high specialization. For example, in specialization in crop farming will lead to higher prices in crops being sold, while specialization in winery will increase the price of wine being sold. Next is the Relationships tab, which shows how much the player has progressed his relationship with each NPC in the game. He could go for a run where he's befriended every NPC of Stardew Valley and learned about their stories beyond their two-dimensional and stereotypical appearance. Or, be like me, an introvert in game and in real life, and only advance a relationship with one NPC that will be a future spouse. But it doesn't hurt to advance the relationships with other NPCs since all of them are fleshed out characters with their own backstories and struggles. Stardew Valley mirrors real life, where the player has to progress their relationship with villagers, and the villagers will, in turn, share more about themselves with the player. In Skytree Village, a lot of the tasks that the player does in the beginning of the game are the same tasks that the player will be doing by the end of the game. Harvesting and watering crops, petting and feeding animals, and so on. On the other hand, Stardew Valley offers some forms of automation. The player can choose to avoid watering the plants in favor of crafting sprinklers that will water plants in a certain area depending on the level of the sprinkler. Tier 1 sprinklers will water the 4 cardinal directions next to it, Tier 2 sprinklers will water an entire 3x3 area, Tier 3 sprinklers will water 5x5, and attaching a pressure nozzle on each sprinkler will increase the radius by 1. So technically the Tier 4 sprinkler will water a 7x7 area around it. The player can also avoid harvesting crops by adding a Junimo hut, which will automatically harvest crops in a 17x17 area. But the drawback is usually the speed of their harvesting, since they will slowly harvest crops from morning until nighttime, which leaves little time for replanting. However, they can be used for crops that do not need to be replanted after harvesting, like beans or strawberries. The players can also choose to build deluxe farmhouses, which automates placing hay from storage into the feeders of the animals. And combine this with the auto grabber and auto petter, the player will not even have to do a lot of the usual menial tasks that entails from being a rancher. Instead, the player will just pay a quick visit to the building to grab the harvested resources. Granted, all of these are unlocked usually at the end of the game, with millions of coins required to even buy them. This automation leaves the player with more time in the day to do other things that can't be automated, like fishing, checking beehives for honey, or checking sheds for finished processed products like pickles, jams, or wines. Overall, player impact in the world inside the game is a must-have for this genre. After all, the player is still interacting with the rural world. For Skytree Village, the impact can be seen by the growing number of villagers due to the restoration of Skytrees. The number of NPCs will also increase with the villages, albeit being soulless. The player will be able to marry a spouse and start a family. On the other hand, for Stardew Valley, the player's impact is very visible, especially on the part of the community center. The player can make an impactful choice very early in the game, simply by purchasing a JojaMart membership for 5,000 gold. which leaves the player with a choice of restoring the community center by completing bundles, or turning it into a Jojo Mart warehouse, which only requires a certain amount of gold per bundle. Whichever side the player chooses, the town of Stardew Valley is heavily affected. If the community center is restored, Jojo Corporation abandons Jojo Mart. If the community center is turned into a warehouse, Jojo Mart will ask for more investment to turn it into a movie house. So the choice is immediately left to the player if they want to go the easy but more expensive route or the more slow and grinding route. Stardew Valley offers a much more full narrative compared to its predecessor, Harvest Moon, to the point where a lot of Stardew Valley's features would reflect the message that it's trying to deliver. First, its accessibility in so many platforms helps to deliver the message of anti-corporations. Second, the graphical choice helps deliver the message of embracing the more traditional rural lifestyle with a 2D pixel art style versus a more modern 3D art style. Third, Stardew Valley's mechanics of no tutorial closely relates to their story of self-discovery, where you start as an urban office worker to a full-fledged farmer. Fourth, Stardew Valley creates a lot of points for progression. Progression for skills, relationships, etc. Really highlight how the player is settling into a place called Stardew Valley. And the last is automation, where the player in the end of the game will be able to automate certain menial tasks in order to make time for other tasks that cannot be fully automated. This delivers the important message that shows how modernity, with balance from traditions, will be able to form a more optimized system that does not damage the environment. Ultimately, the player can interpret that result as a message that corporations need to be responsible for their negative effects on people and environment. Jojo Corporation could have been able to exist peacefully in Stardew Valley if they did their processes more responsibly, rather than being completely driven away due to how much negative effects they are bringing.